see our God, He holds the victory. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today, and we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place, and we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. We shout out your praise. We sing to the God who heals. We sing to the God who saves. We sing to the God who always makes a way. As we all hung on that cross, and He rose up from that grave, my heart still rolling stone away. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today, and we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place, and we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. We were the beggars, now we're royalty. We were the prisoners, now we're running free. We are forgiven, accepted, redeemed by His grace. Let the house of the Lord sing praise. 'Cause we were the beggars, now we're royalty. We were the prisoners, now we're running free. We are forgiven, accepted, redeemed by His grace. Let the house of the Lord sing praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today, and we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place, and we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. We shout out your praise.
I wonder how much it would be worth. When you account for the cost of living and the average wage in those days, how much was it worth? 750 pounds of silver and 150 pounds of gold. That's nearly 1,000 pounds of precious metals. Some say its value today would be in the billions, and yes, that's billions with a B as in holy Batman. This is His gift, a gift to the King of Israel with a request for healing. And the size of the gift reflects the rank as commander of the whole country's army. This guy is big stuff. A gift like this, with a request for healing, was the way countries asked for favors from one another. It was the way things were done. The Egyptians were known for healing eye diseases, and the Babylonians were known for their exorcisms. It's the same when you or I seek a specialist and pay the going rate. And boy, we know those specialists are very expensive. As important as this military commander is, as highly regarded as he is, I'll bet you've never heard of him. But that's the idea behind our new series that Arturo kicked off last week that will take us through the summer. These are the greatest stories never told. So don't feel bad if you've never heard of Naaman. Even Arturo had never heard his name, and that man knows his Bible, especially his Old Testament. So turn to 2 Kings chapter 5. You see, one thing about 1st and 2nd Kings is that repetition of he did evil in the eyes of the Lord just as his father had. And on the flip side, he did good in the eyes of the Lord. And then at each king's death, as for all the other events of King so-and-so's reign, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel? One king after another. So it's no wonder we miss some of these stories. Did you find 2 Kings? It comes right after 1st and 2nd Samuel in the Old Testament, which provides a hint as to where we are in history. You see, Samuel is the prophet who anointed both Saul and David, the first 2 kings of Israel. And 1st King opens with David's son, Solomon, beginning his reign. By 2nd Kings, it's a revolving door of kings. And this greatest story, never told, takes place during that time. It's the time of the prophet Elisha, the reign of King Joram, who was evil, but not as bad as some of the others. So let's dive in. We're in chapter 5, and we'll start at verse 1. Now, Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now, bands from Aram had gone out and taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. So we meet Naaman, commander-in-chief of Aram's entire army, a great man, highly regarded, valiant, and victorious. But Naaman has leprosy, which in this case is non-contagious, something like eczema or psoriasis. He still commands the army. He hasn't been banished to isolation as many lepers are, but his healing is still important because leprosy is considered punishment by the gods. That's probably not a good look for a military leader. Israel and Aram, which we know as Syria, north of Israel, they have on and off peace treaties. At this point in history, they're at peace, but there's still some border skirmishes. So a captive Israeli girl serves in this top-ranking official's home. Let's continue. Verse 3. The Israeli girl said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I'll send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter, I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman has his HMO referral and his copay, and it's an exorbitant gift. The silver alone amounts to 3,000 years of wages. And one scholar put the value at $750 million back in the year 2000. This is the way countries do business with each other. So Naaman presents his letter to the king of Israel. And verse 7, as soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to cure his leprosy? He's trying to pick a quarrel with me." Now, let's step into King Jehoram's shoes. There's no mention that Elisha comes recommended. The letter asks the king to heal Naaman. Of course, the king of Aram makes a presumption. He presumes that Elisha is under the king of Israel's authority and can be ordered to perform the healing. But King Joram doesn't even consider Elisha because Elijah is not under his direct command. In addition, Elisha and the king don't really get along very well, so Elisha isn't in the forefront of the king's mind. Instead, the king thinks it's a setup. He thinks the king of Aram will say he's unwilling to heal Naaman and use this as an excuse to break their tenuous peace treaty and throw Israel into war. He does what a king in distress does. He tears his royal robes, which signals a national crisis. This is not the response Naaman expected because he's familiar with dignitary travel to foreign countries for this kind of healing. He fully expected King Joram to regally summon the specialist to the palace, and they'd talk about sports while they waited. Then Naaman would be healed and back on his way. Simple, efficient, and orderly, as he would do himself. Instead, the king is having a complete emotional meltdown. Naaman's probably thinking, okay, now what? And let's see in verse 8. When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message. Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Naturally, the news spreads quickly. The country is on the brink of war. And of course, Elisha hears about it. And we briefly note Elijah's reprimand that the king didn't immediately consider God's healing prophet, but let fear overtake him. But let's give King Joram a break. Naaman, valiant warrior, commander-in-chief, arrives on horses and chariots. Perhaps he would have been a little less intimidating in a different vehicle, like the family minivan pulling a gold-filled U-Haul trailer. Chariots are vehicles of war. But then again, I can't imagine that that's the only way this commander travels. And let's notice that not only is the king freaking out, but he doesn't command Elisha to come to the royal palace to heal the foreign dignitary. No, Elisha instructs the king to send Naaman to him. This is extremely unusual for a king and for a dignitary. Is Naaman shaking his head in disbelief, like, what's happening here? Or is he feeling annoyed? Whatever he's feeling, his band of horses and chariots, decorated war hero and servants, silver and gold, they all show up at Elisha's house. Knock, knock, knock. And we're in verse 10. Elisha sent a messenger to say to Naaman, go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you'll be cleansed. Now let's step into Naaman's shoes. How would you, a 5-star general standing tall in your shiny chariot, respond to this? Oh, it's that simple? Great, let's go. Hey, I'll drop the gold off after I'm healed. Or, wait a minute, the Jordan River is 40 miles further south and it's really kind of hard to get to. Or, we can see what Naaman actually did in verse 11. But Naaman went away angry and said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers in Damascus, better than any of the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he turned and he went off in a rage. Or, like Naaman, you could be enraged. So why is Naaman angry? First of all, is obvious. His pride is hurt. You send your messenger to me with these silly instructions? Don't you know who I am? This attitude, this pride, may very well be part of his healing. But also, Naaman is familiar with healing rituals, and this is not the way they're done. Now, washing is usually involved, and one well-known Mesopotamian healing ritual does say wash 7 times facing upstream, and then again 7 times facing downstream. But what Elisha is proposing can't work. One key component is missing. Elisha, the holy man, is supposed to be present, to raise his hand and recite some special word over the water, use his power to bless the water and cause the healing. It's supposed to be a little bit of a production. Elisha hasn't even shown his face and doesn't show any sign of traveling with Naaman to the Jordan. No wonder Naaman says, "Okay, fellas, we're done here. Let's go." Elisha's absence is intentional. It leaves all the credit to God alone. The holy specialist, the healer, is God, and the instructions are from God alone. The prophet is only God's mouthpiece. Naaman is being told to follow these specific instructions that are somewhat familiar but differ in particular details. It can't be just any river, but the Jordan, the river prescribed by God. Wash 7 times. There is one simple way to be healed, an obedient way. But Naaman is not used to taking orders. And Elisha is absent because it's not about Elisha. It's about God. It's about trusting God instead of those familiar, well-known way of doing things. Can we identify with Naaman, who expects things to be done the way they've always been done? As we return to worship together in the sanctuary, we have in our minds just how it should be because we remember it. We've been imagining it as we worshiped at home all these months. And when things are different than we anticipated, we might be a little sad or disappointed. We might even be angry. But we worship God, not the traditions we've admittedly come to love, the way we've always done things. Worship is not about the lead pastor or the music. The way we do worship and the way we are the church in Medfield and Metro West is led by God. Now, I'm not suggesting that we all ignore Arturo and Kayla as our leaders. Well, maybe we can ignore Arturo. But I am suggesting that God is in all and over all. God has the power and calls the shots. God is our lead. The future of UCC Medfield is in God's hands, and it's our job to hold loosely to the familiar way things have always been done and listen for the particular way God instructs us to do things differently. It's about obedience. Hey, let's admit it. Let's just say it out loud. Change is hard. Adapting to change takes time. I am with you. Phil won't preach any more sermons. Someone answers the phone with a new voice and greets us in the office. You are still watching from home, and we will miss seeing you in person. At the most important of all, I can't sit in my usual pew behind Barbara, Linda, and Jane because my pew is blocked off so we can safely distance. Change is hard, but we can support each other through change, like Naaman's servants did. So let's continue our story with verse 13. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" So Naaman went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him. And his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. Now, I love Naaman's servants who bravely try to calm their enraged master. "Oh, it's not that far, sir. What have you got to lose?" And the results are better than he'd hoped for. Dare I say, far better? Certainly far better than any expensive facial cream I've tried. His skin is as smooth and wrinkle-free as a baby's bottom. He is not just healed, but made completely new. He obeyed God's unusual, illogical, slightly familiar but different path, and the results exceeded his expectations. Now, let's step into Naaman's shoes again. Verse 15. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except Israel. Please accept now a gift from your servant." And the prophet Elijah answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. For Naaman, diplomacy has always meant a gift to the healer or to the king. But Elisha firmly says, "Nope, not 1 shekel." Now, that's not to say Elisha has never accepted a gift. But in this case, Naaman needed to learn that God's ways are uniquely different from the way the world works. And perhaps this is our second lesson from the story that's never told. God's ways are not the world's ways. Church works differently. Now, we can absolutely use our talents and our knowledge and our experience to serve God. The church is strong and vibrant when we put all these different gifts together in serving one purpose. And we need every member's contribution, and we are so very grateful. But sometimes we discover that what's business as usual in the world doesn't work for a church. Naaman thought he knew exactly how it should be done. But his healing demonstrates that God sometimes tweaks what we're considering standard practice and calls us in a surprising direction that leads to a bigger outcome than our wildest dreams. We can't put God in our familiar box so that we feel comfortable. Following God requires obedience, listening, trusting, and obeying. So now, Naaman's got a dilemma. Does he return to his pagan country and his pagan duties, which include worshiping his king's pagan gods? He can't return and refuse to follow customs. How can he worship the one true God whom he has just encountered amid pagan surroundings? Should he abandon Aram and remain in Israel? Should he go home but resign his position, even become some sort of martyr? What will Elisha advise? And so we turn to verse 17. "If you will not accept this gift," said Naaman, Please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry. For your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord. But may the Lord forgive your servant this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this. And Elisha said, go in peace. First, notice how many times Naaman humbles himself as Elisha's servant. 5 times. I do believe Naaman's pride was healed along with his leprosy. But what's the deal with the dirt? Well, in those days, gods were local, having power only in the region. In Naaman's mind, going home meant leaving the God of Israel behind. Remember, he has just proclaimed in verse 15, now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So, Naaman wants to take some of Israel back home with him. Enough Israeli soil to build an altar so that when he bows down, as he must, he's really bowing down to the God of Israel. Clever, right? This commander is thinking. And Naaman wants Elisha's approval of his plan. And Elisha gives him, go in peace. Is that a yes? Elisha doesn't solve Naaman's dilemma. He doesn't agree or disagree that taking soil is a good compromise. Elisha refers Naaman to God's guidance. It's as if Elisha just says, I am glad you're thinking about this and working through it, how you're going to do it. God will guide you and give you peace. I admit this answer surprised me because it's totally against what Deuteronomy defines as proper worship. Bow to no other God. I expected Elisha to say, now that you know God, you have to worship it here, like we do. Rather, he says, I know your heart is worshiping the one true God, and God will give you peace. Because peace is a gift from God for the soul. And this is our third lesson. God will guide us and give us peace when we have found the way to live in a world of non-believers, yet continue to honor and worship God alone. We seek God's peace in our particular circumstances, at our point in history, and in our particular culture. Things don't ever remain as they've always been. The world is always changing. And God calls us to adapt to the world and to our circumstances. Yes, change is hard and uncomfortable. No one likes it. But God can take us to unimaginable places. Church friends, we are at the very beginning of a very exciting time in the life of UCC Medfield. Let's be brave. Let's look to God for our cues and not merely cling to the way things always have been done around here. Unless it helps define who we are. Believe me, I am the worst about this. Ask anyone who's been in meetings with me. Well, the way we used to do it was, but I'm trying to take a new perspective. I observe the progression of how things have come to be this way, because they've always been changing. Friends, UCC Medfield has an opportunity as we transition to new leaders we get to step back and reflect, to keep the familiar, cherished things that help define who we are as UCC Medfield, and release what doesn't serve us any longer, that might even be holding us back from God's great vision for us. Oh, God has plans for UCC Medfield that far exceed anything we can ever dream. I'm sure of it. Well, that's today's message, but that is not the end of this story. So please check it out, because the rest of the story holds very relevant lessons. You see, not everyone agreed with the way Elisha handled things. There is dissent and deceit and power grabbing and intrigue before it's all over. Read it, 2 Kings 5. Because next week we're on to another greatest story never told. And here's one of our familiar customs, a benediction, a sending out into the world. Now, do I or don't I raise my hand to indicate that I'm saying a blessing over you? Today, I will. Let us go, keeping our eyes on God, who is our ultimate leader. Let us go, keeping our ears open for his whispers that call us to love like Jesus in sometimes unfamiliar ways. Let us go out into the world of many gods and seek God's peace, that we are honoring and worshiping the one true God. Go in peace, my friends. Amen.